session is this afternoon. The other two PhD sessions are on Thursday, according to the program, and I just want to make the information that because of the absence of one of the speakers, Josif Maravelakis, he is just not here, we will there make some changes and change the talk of Sascha Gunold about the German withdrawal, about the withdrawal from Eastern Germany in the 1990s. We will change that to the panel 3 of the PhD sessions, just to let you know that. I want to remind you all about the main purpose of these PhD panels. We want to give young historians, young colleagues who are normally PhD students an opportunity to present their work, to present, make a presentation on their theses, and then to discuss them. We don't have to be only nice with them, because our intention is to bring them further, to improve their work, to criticize when there is something to criticize. But I say you can criticize always in a nice way. So that's how I would handle this thing. Our first panel is chaired by Professor Aaron Shai from the University of Tel Aviv, right? And I'm very happy that because we have some Israeli topics now here in the first session, that you were ready to moderate this first panel. I must honestly say it's not my point of research exactly. So it's very nice that you came to us today to chair this panel. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. The thing is, though, you know that two at least of the participants are already PhDs. You know, they are not PhD candidates. When in Israel it takes so long because of the military service that when you get your PhD in Europe, they get a full professorship because of the difference in time. But anyway, so I will not be very harsh with them. I had the honor to be the rector of Tel Aviv University, so I know that with PhD candidates you have to be harsh so that the PhD work will be really perfect. But these are veterans. They, at least, you also have your PhD. You are working on your PhD. Claudia is the only one, but the two gentlemen here have already presented their PhD. The first participant really will be Shlomi Shitrit. He is the head of the Israeli Police Heritage Center and focuses on police military history in Israel. And I advise you to behave nicely here in this session. And he has done quite a lot of work. So, and I might say, though, that in the army, at the Israeli Defense Force, he was even in a higher rank than he was lieutenant colonel. So in order to join our police force, you have to be demoted to some extent. So please, without further ado, I will ask Shlomi Shitrit to talk to us about the thin khaki line, it's called, the police during Israel's War of Independence. We won't talk about the police in Israel today. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I was once told that the worst thing after speaking right after lunch is speaking right before lunch. So I hope it will be okay. The theme of this conference is the creation of new states and the collapse of old empires, as well as the commemoration of Israel's 70th anniversary. In the following paper, we will look into a little known aspect of Israeli history, which deals with its police, and I think that might serve as an example to the dynamics, to the processes which accompany the collapse of empires and the creation of new states. This is not the subject of my PhD. I deal with British counterinsurgency tactics during the Arab Revolt, 1936-39. However, I believe that mostly due to lack of interest in police history. I think that the research into police-related subject can shed new light on almost every aspect of the specific society in which we deal, because you never really know a society until you look at it through the eyes of the policemen on the streets, and I hope that this talk will help convince you regarding that. So, what is the police for? And here we have the Palestine Police Ordinance from 1926, which defines the roles and tasks of the Palestine Police Force, on which I will talk more. In modern times, since 19th century in the United Kingdom, the police are considered to be the government's arm against crime and public disorder. It's an organization which serves the community by preventing unlawful behavior or by prosecuting it. The policeman, in a way, embodies the state in the public's eye. And the trust that the police gets from the public grants legitimacy to the regime, to the state, to the organization, to the national organization at all. Here we have men from the Palestine Police Force. In Petah Tikva, by the way, you can take the same photograph at the same place. We are still using the British Tegart forts from the 1940s as our police stations. Palestine Police Force was the organization responsible for law and order in Palestine from 1920 to 1948. It was a colonial police, meaning that it was organized on a, let's call it national organization. It was responsible for the entire country, unlike police units in Britain or the United States, which are either according to territorial division or municipal or in municipal authorities. And it was divided from a manpower point of view. You can see that there are different kinds of officers. They have different kinds of hats. Because the British police, the Palestine Police Force was divided into a British section, namely British nationals who came to serve in Palestine as policemen, and Palestinian police officers, which were both Jews and Arabs. And you can see that the strength of the PPF in 1947 included mostly British policemen. That was very, very irregular. During most of the mandate, they were between 1/4 to 1/3 of the force, but due to the security deterioration in the security situation at the time, they brought more policemen. Now, like other colonial polices in Sri Lanka, in Burma, in Kenya, and elsewhere, almost all positions of responsibility were held by British personnel, and I mean from the rank of sergeant and above. The only local policemen who were given responsibility or position of command were those who gained the trust of their commanders, and there were very few. One thing to bear in mind is that there is a very, very great difference between a colonial police and the police as we like to think of that. And we see this headline from 1948 which summarizes that perfectly. A reporter looks at British police in the Holy Land and finds them not like London bobbies. Although, truth be told, Rollo Goldfoot, the newspaper woman who wrote that, was the wife of Stanley Goldfoot, who was in Lehi, so she's not impartial. But you have to understand that unlike the police in London, for example, which sees itself as a civil service, they think they have to rely on public consent, on public support. Colonial police forces mainly rely on coercion. The first and foremost task is to keep the king's peace, namely to prevent insurrections, and once they break out, to repress them as quickly and as cheaply as possible. Now, following the Second World War, the Jewish struggle against British rule intensified, and the Palestine Police Force became the major enemy of the Yishuv, the organized Jewish community in Palestine. It was the police who arrested illegal immigrants. It was the police who conducted searches, enforced curfews, who looked for the Jewish underground members, and if they caught them, tortured them. And this, in turn, made the police the main target for Etzel and Lehi, and also for Haganah at times. Here we see the CID, Criminal Investigation Department, headquarters in Jerusalem, Jaffa Street, after being bombed for the second time, by the way, by Lehi. And between January 1945 and May 1948, Jewish insurgents killed 89 British policemen. 69 of them fell during the last 18 months of the mandate, meaning almost one policeman every week, which is a very, very high rate. Now, the final period of mandate saw a collapse of British rule in Palestine. The British military, and more notably so the British police, abandoned its formal duties. The Palestine police force, starting in December 1947, evacuated the British policemen and the Arab policemen from the Jewish areas and brought them into military bases or into Bevingrads, security areas inside Jerusalem, like the one pictured here. They also evacuated most of their equipment, cars, weapons, documents, leaving very little behind them for the remaining policemen and for historians today, sadly. Now, naturally, this created a very vicious circle between the Yishuv and the police, and some British policemen began feeling resentment or fear towards the Jews, and the impending end of the mandate also lowered the motivation of the policeman, because nobody wants to risk his life for a lost cause. So we have many reports of British police officers either standing aside during Arab attacks on Jews or even assisting the Arabs in their attacks. Here we have another part of the article that we've seen the headline of before, and you can see the streets were thronged and there were plenty of British policemen. This is during the attack of Arabs on the Mamila Commerce Center, and they said that the British policemen seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. For once, the wrath of the population was not directed against them. This was indeed a break from the procedure of the last 2 years. At times, the animosity even became hate. And here we have part of a pamphlet which was apparently written by a British policeman and widely circulated. There isn't any British police officer serving in Palestine in 47-48 who doesn't know of this song, the Dying Policeman song. And you can see they're very creative. Although when you experience the climate in Israel in August, then perhaps our national home is in hell, like they say. So there were even reports of British policemen shooting at Jews in Jerusalem, or even in one case, this is confirmed, they turned in Haganah members after arresting them to the Arabs, which promptly tortured, murdered, and dismembered them. Now, it should be noted that, of course, not all British policemen behaved like this or expressed such views, and there were also Haganah sympathizers within the British police, but whatever their behavior, it is clear that they were not fulfilling the role. They were not impartial enforcers of law and order. Now, the withdrawal of the British police from the Jewish settlements created a very peculiar situation, because the lawful government had given up, in effect, any effort to enforce the law, and there was no legal institution who could replace it. So, for a short interim period, beginning in December 1947 and ending with the Declaration of Independence, the only element which had both legal authority to act and the motivation to act in order to enforce the law were the Jewish policemen of the Palestine police force and about 1,700 Jewish supernumerary policemen, notrim in Hebrew, of the Jewish settlement police. There are about 700 Jewish policemen who were, like I said, relatively low rank, operated as regular police. They patrolled the streets, they gave traffic tickets, speeding tickets, they investigated crimes, etc. About half of the force, 360 men, were stationed at Tel Aviv at various police stations, another 200 in Jerusalem, and the remainder throughout Jewish or mixed towns in Palestine. Now, during the mandate, the Jewish agency could not control recruitment into the Palestine police force, meaning that only a small part of Jewish policemen in the Palestine police force were Haganah members. This created a problem for the Haganah because they knew they could not trust all members of the police, either because some of them were sympathizers of Etzel or Lehi, or because they did not conform to the Yishuv or the Haganah, or whatever you want to call it, political line. Now, Haganah was very quick to fill that vacuum formed by the British police, and you can see an order from January 6th sent to all Hebrew, all Jewish policemen and police officers, wherever they are, and in that order, following a request of transfer of many policemen from the British commanders who are still in charge of them, even after the British police has evacuated its own personnel from the stations, the British police still commands, at least in theory, the Jewish policemen. Once a week, a British officer comes to check that all the weapons are still there, and they request transfer. They don't want to be in the frontier, they don't want to be in Arab towns or in mixed towns, and the Haganah orders them to remain at the post, and very, very explicitly that they are now subject to the nation's authority and to Haganah's discipline. Again, this is meant for people who are, for the most part, are not Haganah members. So what did these policemen do during the interim period? The first task they had were paramilitary. And here we see Jewish policemen on the frontier between Jaffa and Tel Aviv. On the day of the British police withdrawal from Tel Aviv, December 15, 1947. They manned checkposts, they conducted armed patrols, and you have to remember they are the only Jews legally allowed to carry weapons at Palestine at the time. And although the British didn't always enforce that and did not always confiscate arms from Haganah members, at times they did, like what happened in Jerusalem that I told you about. And the policemen were the only one who could be sure that their arms will remain with them. They also were used, because of that, as couriers, passing weapons and armaments and ammunition for Haganah units, most notably in Jerusalem. Later, Inspector General of the Israel Police, Chaim Tavori, was wounded as a constable when he was smuggling ammunition into the Jewish quarter during 1948. The Jewish Settlement Police, or JSP, was formed in 1939 by the British. It was an all-Jewish force. There were a few British sergeants and officers, and it was, in fact, a legal front for the Haganah. The Jewish agency controlled recruitment into that force. The British knew perfectly well that they are arming Haganah members, and they were responsible for the protection of Jewish settlement, Jewish property, and Jewish traffic, mostly in the rural areas of Palestine. Now, they were, in fact, a gendarmerie, although they're called the police, although they were a part of the Palestinian police force, they never dealt with regular police duties. They were armed, as you see, with machine guns, submachine guns, rifles. They had patrol vehicles. They even had armored vehicles, and therefore they were invaluable during the first phase of the Israeli War of Independence, the civil war between the Arabs and the Jews, and they were fully controlled by the Haganah. They acted from December 1947 directly under the command of local Haganah commanders. In fact, the Hanafot, the sub-districts, and later the brigade commanders of the Haganah. Now, in early 1948, the situation got so difficult that Haganah had to use every available unit on the lines. And here we see the Palestine police band, which, by the way, is the longest existing security unit in Israel. It exists in the same organization since 1920 and until today. By the way, they still speak in that unit the same language that they spoke during the mandate, Russian. And in 1948, these musicians took up arms, and they were deployed in Jerusalem and used as a part of the Haganah's fighting force. And they, again, conducted patrols, manned posts, escorted traffic. And on May 15, they even participated in Operation Kilshon, Pitchfork, alongside Haganah, Chativat Etzioni Brigade, Lehi and Etzel, in taking over the British security zones after they have been evacuated, and they took over the police national headquarters in the Russian compound. During that period, from January 1948 to June 1948, 3 bandsmen were killed in duty while fighting the Arabs, the first casualties of the Israel police. Now, parallel to that, the Jewish Agency begins planning for the establishment of the new state, and on November 9, 1947, Golda Meirson, later Golda Meir, is appointed alongside with Yechezkel Sakharov to plan the police for the new state. And they work very quickly. By December 21, they present Ben-Gurion their plan, which is approved. And on 26 March, Ben-Gurion orders the Haganah, you can see it's the Haganah High Command, to appoint Yechezkel Sahar as the first Inspector General once the state will be established, and to provide 1,200 men to the police. And we can see this note from 10 days later that due to the necessities of the war, the police did not get those 1,200 men, and there were very, very low priority given to it. For the police, the Declaration of Independence was just another day on the job. And here we have an entry from a station diary in Hadera, and you see the British mandate is dead, the state of Israel has been established, long live the Hebrew state. And you have to understand that when the police officer who wrote that entry began writing it, he served with the Palestine police force. When he ended, he was an Israeli policeman. And that's how the Israel police was formed. The provisional government published an edict forcing, in fact, all policemen to remain at their jobs. And And following the invasion of the Arab armies, the police took also civic defense roles. For example, we have here an entry about Egyptian air raid on Tel Aviv, another one on Arab Legion bombardment of Jerusalem, and we see again the bandmaster, one of the musicians being commended for bravery. I don't think it happened since. The police also took part in every dramatic occurrence during that period. For example, the assassination of Count Bernadotte in Jerusalem on September 17. The police conducted the very ineffective, I must say, investigation. The case was closed without finding the guilty parties, and also continued dismantling Lehi. And also they filled their normal duties looking for robbers, for car thieves, which were very, very common at the time, and even for lost donkeys. So if you've seen him, please let me know. We're still looking for it. Lastly, since the Israel police sought to create itself as different from the Palestine police force, as a modern liberal police based on public consent and trust, from the beginning it began to tell both the public and the policemen that something is different, that we are your servants, we are not your oppressors. We can see that from June, July, December 1948. And I think this is a great example. This is an order, a command published by the commander of the Tel Aviv district. It's called good manners. It's dated July 9th, meaning that the Egyptian army is now standing at Ad Halom and Ashdod, 25 kilometers from Tel Aviv, and Ramat Rachel on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and that's what's important to that commander to demand from his police officer. He demands them to say shalom whenever they meet the public. Now, it may look like petty micromanagement. It's not. For a modern police, for a police which seeks public trust and public consent, this is perhaps even more important than manning posts and positions. So to conclude, the story of the police during the last months of the mandates and the first months of the State of Israel represents both the collapse of colonial power and the consolidation of the new state. The first Israeli police officers filled a unique role during that period by being a legally armed force alongside with the efforts to enable the continuation of ordinary life as far as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shlomi Shitrit, for a most interesting talk. I think we have learned something. And we shall continue now with the only PhD candidate here in the Claudia Lushu Pedersen from the Danish Defense College, and she is a major, if I'm not mistaken, in the Air Force.
Yep.
And she will talk to us about the political and military challenges of urban warfare in the Israeli-Arab conflict from 82 to 2014, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to...
20 minutes, so take your time.
Yes, I will take my time, trust me. So, let me begin with setting the scene. There are several reasons to assume that future war will mainly be in the cities. Research in demography and economical geography suggests that 4 megatrends are decisive in shaping future life, and hereby also the conflictual environment, and these are rapid population growth, accelerating urbanization, littoralization, and increasing connectedness. These trends are not new, but the velocity in these trends has increased to an unprecedented degree, and they're mutually reinforcing. Predictions indicate that in 2050, about 75% of the world's population will be living in cities. And at least the last 10 years, more than 50% have already been living in cities, especially cities in Asia, Latin America and Africa, and especially coastal cities will grow the most due to population growth, but also due to migration into the cities. Almost all of the world's population growth will happen in these low-income parts of the world with its higher concentration of unstable countries. Adding to this, climate changes are very likely to entail flooding in these coastal cities, so it's not hard to imagine a complex future urban environment. Moreover, the rapidly growing urban population will increasingly be connected via satellite, media, and mobile phones, which all allow the global spread of political messages that may worsen conflicts and assist in mobilizing and coordinating resources for violent purposes. In Sao Paulo in Brazil lives 20 million people, whereas 5 million lives in the favelas, as you can see on the left side on the slide. That's about as many people as lives in the entire kingdom of Denmark. Not only the megacities with their scale and complexity will be a serious challenge to the military operations, but also the about 850 cities with a population between 500,000 and 9.9 million people also represent a complex environment. So, my project's aim is to provide a deeper understanding of the challenges in military operations in the complex and densely populated urban areas on the political and strategic operational levels. In order to achieve this, the Israeli-Arab conflict from 1982 to 2014 will serve as the empirical foundation, and contemporary war theory, and especially the current thinking on urban warfare, will be used to facilitate the analysis, which aims at being able to qualify and hopefully enhance existing theory on the subject. The following is thus a discussion and description of how I have designed my project. So now let me turn to the overall difficulties in dealing with urban warfare. So, how do we deal with this massive complexity connected to urban warfare? Let us first take a short look at the research and literature so far. The amount of literature that in one way or another provides insight to urban warfare is enormous. And in order to try to clarify this, I have, as you can see on the slide, divided the subject into two main fields: the city and armed conflict. As you can see, a lot of academic fields or research areas relate to the city: history, architecture, urban geography, archaeology, political science, economy, demography, infrastructure, and networks or connectedness. And the last goes for both individuals and cities. In my opinion, in relation to armed conflict, we have to consider the issues listed on the other side. And I will in the following discuss why. The much debated question about the city as a battlefield, is it unique or not compared to other battlefields? The changing character of war, and within this, conventional war, new wars, asymmetric warfare, hybrid warfare, information warfare, media, web, public opinion, cyber warfare, terrorism, guerrilla warfare, multi-domain battlefield, and before I lose my breath, the laws of armed conflict and lawfare. Also research or literature on fighting in cities, which are between police or armed government forces and civilian protesters or gangs, especially as seen with the riots in North American cities and the gang and drug-related violence in Latin American cities as Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, could also have been listed. Little attention had been paid to urban warfare until the mid-90s. The Battle for Mogadishu in October 93 made the study of urban warfare interesting to the US. Furthermore, the Russian experience in Chechnya and the Palestinian Intifada against Israel indicated that asymmetrical operations would be staged on the urban scene. But because of 9/11, the US interest decreased. Furthermore, the interest in urban warfare was merely on the tactical level and not the strategic. And this is still the case. Research is still mainly focused on the tactical level and not on the strategic political level. It is debated how to approach this field of research in order to gain relevant insight about urban warfare. And in my opinion, it's very important to look to the future in order not to fight the battle of yesterday, not in an attempt to predict, but to foresee. Thus enabling commanders and political leaders to make the best possible decisions in an unpredictable future. However, the use of historical cases is, in my opinion, essential, and I guess the audience here won't disagree, since historical cases are the only empirical foundation we have instead of just leaning on theory. The key thing is here to draw theory and history together and directing it at the future. In order to be able to handle this very complex challenge as urban warfare is, it's mandatory to treat it interdisciplinary. The city itself is inherently multifaceted, and this complexity cannot be encompassed by only one field of research. And add to this the complexity of modern war, and it's not hard to imagine a Pandora's box. So, on this background, my research question is as follows. What have been the political and military challenges and experiences for the Israelis in waging urban warfare on the strategic operational level in the years from 82 till 2014? And how do the lessons of these conflicts contribute to existing urban warfare theory? With this in mind, I will share with you my considerations on why I find the issues listed before of particular importance, and why I find that the Israeli Arab wars provide a very good empirical case. Let us therefore first turn to the city, which provides us with the scene. Even though the city is the object of urban warfare, it's rarely discussed what a city is. Are all cities the same? Just some bigger and some smaller? Or are each city unique? Do they perhaps share some common characteristics? How do we perceive cities, or how can we define a city? As you can see on the slide, physical differences are obvious. Defining the concept of a city might seem easy, since it's a term we use almost every day without much further thought to what is actually meant by it. However, the task is both complex and considerable, but vital if you want to compare cities or parts of cities. Furthermore, distinctions have to be made between cities, towns, villages, and settlements. However, different countries have different demographics and geographical definitions of cities. In France, it takes 2,000 people to make a city. In Japan, it takes 30,000 people to make a city. Legally, a city can be distinguished from a town when it has a structured system of governance and has delegated powers to oversee local legislation, as well as the management of resources, and the residents elect representatives. The simplest answer to what a city is of course the physical description. What can we see? The urban physical terrain is man-made and complex. It consists of buildings, maybe old city centers with narrow streets, physical infrastructure, as roads, highways, ports, railways, electricity plants, airports, and so on. And then there's, of course, the subterranean. Subways, sewers, basements, and other underground installations made for civilian use, but all of them can be used in time of conflict for other purposes. And then there are also the tunnels dug for operational purposes. Tunnels have been dug for warfare purposes throughout history, but especially ISIS tunnels in Mosul and the Hamas tunnels in Gaza have recently demonstrated tunnels as a very important part of modern urban warfare. The urban environment includes the dense population, which of course is very variable in both density but also in size, as already indicated. But also the infrastructure concerning human services, such as waste disposal, healthcare, and the networks or interconnectedness between people both within the city, but also with the national, transnational, or even global reach. Not just networks or interconnectedness between people, but also between cities is of significant interest. As Peter Taylor, who has a geohistorical approach, states, no city exists in isolation. External relations are the second nature of cities. Cities are networks. Obviously, there are big differences in the strength and reach in different cities' networks. Are they merely national, transnational, or global? How is the dependence or interdependence between network cities? Does a given city have command over others? Are the networks economical, political, social, commercial, or even criminal? We also have to relate to the fact that some networks might be hidden or that we are unaware of the strength of known networks. A very common approach is to view the city as a system, both in military as in civilian studies. Considering the city as a system, it is thus important to keep in mind that elements within the city are interacting, to a lesser or greater degree, or are networking with elements nationally, transnationally, or globally, and that a living system or organism constantly changes. And this last part about constant change or dynamics is very important to keep in mind when planning or conducting military operations. So, take it one step up. What about the megacities? A megacity is normally characterized as a city with over 10 million people. As earlier indicated, due to population growth, the number of megacities is rising, and the megacities are especially spreading in the developing world, in Africa and South Asia. In numbers, there were 3 megacities in 1980. In 2017, there were 37. The biggest being Tokyo and Jakarta, each having a population with over 30 million people. In many of these new and fast-growing megacities, mainly due to an influx of lower-income people, it's very difficult for governments to keep up with the pace and provide basic services. And this can easily make a hotbed for unrest. As said before, a mere number of people, and here 10 million, is not very useful distinguishing a city from a megacity. What about a city of 8-9 million people? That's still a very big city. Much more important is the function of the city. Common for many of the world's megacities, however, because of their scale, is that they have areas with an extreme density of people. They have exceptional man-made buildings and structures. They have a big influence on their regions, and most likely both national, international, and global influence. This goes, for instance, for Singapore, which have only 6.5 million people, but it's both interconnected and has global influence. In comparison, Baghdad, with around 4 million people in 2003, had only few buildings above 12 floors, no subterranean transportation system, and no major connectedness to global economic or political networks. So, earlier strategies for wars in cities. Already in around 500 BC, in his Art of War, Sun Tzu recommended avoiding cities as battlefields if at all possible. It's widely agreed today that urban fighting is often the worst challenge modern armed forces can meet. Urban warfare demands vast resources, both in troops and logistics. Command and control systems are pressed to the limit, and it's casualty intensive. However, it is also clear that a strategy of avoidance is not always possible, and it seems even less possible in the future, and that we'll come back to. When unavoidable, different strategies have been applied through our history, such as sieges, total destruction, World War II bombings of entire cities, street-to-street combat with a complete disregard of civilian casualties. Gradually, however, humanitarian sentiment, human rights codification, international law, and media attention have rendered these strategies non-viable for Western democracies. In 1968, the battle for Hue during the Vietnam War rendered about 80% of the city destroyed and about 116,000 people homeless. Even though the city was retaken, and as such a tactical success to the US Armed Forces and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the destruction had severe strategic consequences to the US government. And this is just one example that in urban warfare, the risk of winning the battle but losing the war is considerably higher. An interesting feature of Hue was that Life magazine covered the battle and published a story called Paradox of War. The only way Hue could be won was by destroying it. The same has been put forward today about Mosul. So, let's take a closer look on the challenges of fighting in the cities. The challenge of fighting in cities are brilliantly coined by Dr. Russell Glenn from RAND, who explains that, and now I'm quoting, operating in a rural area is like having 3 colored balls on a pool table. You can strike the cue ball. Chances are it may never touch anything else. Operating in a city is like having 7 racks of the colored balls on the table, and you strike the cue ball. And you have no idea what the ultimate consequences are going to be when they all start to impact each other. I think this metaphor is very important to bear in mind when we consider rural versus urban fighting because of the complexity in the latter. You might be able to oversee first or even second order effects, but what about third order effects and further on? There's no apparent link between cause and effect. This metaphor is also very important to keep in mind when touching upon international humanitarian law and speaking of proportionality and what can be reasonably foreseen. The physical terrain alone is a great challenge for an attacking force, but what fundamentally distinguishes military operations in the urban environment from operations in other environments is the density of people and the impact of them and their lives, either directly as civilian casualties or because of the high risk of damaging critical infrastructure. And it's not just the density of people, it's the density of everything. Density of man-made structures, density of infrastructure, density of communication means, density of traffic, density of firing position, density of enemy hiding places, both within buildings and maybe underground and among the civilian population. In cities, large troop formations are impossible, so only small groups of soldiers can stick together, which means that decision-making has to be done on low levels, and furthermore, it's very hard to control such operations. It also increases the risk of engaging own troops. This was also the case in Mogadishu in '93, when non-combatants began to swarm the fragmented American troops. Whereas rural areas are basically rather static, urban areas are dynamic, and they are changeable through both new constructions and demolition, but also moving people and traffic. In time of conflict, the urban environment will be even more rapidly changing because of interaction between armed groups, civilians, and the environment. Furthermore, operations in urban areas will normally require more resources in both personnel, munitions, subsistence, and medical support than other operations. With the possibility of hiding among civilians in buildings on the subterranean, the enemy can to some extent negate the advances of high technological conventional forces. The advantage of aerial intelligence assets is thus limited, and it's difficult to identify and target the enemy. Furthermore, enemy use of protected sites such as hospital or religious buildings, and the use of civilians as human shields make military operations very difficult, as for instance with ISIS in Mosul and Raqqa, and Hamas in Gaza. With a large scale of modern cities, or even megacities, attacking forces must always also prepare for operations within the full spectrum of warfare and at the same time. A different type of operation can be just around the next block. From the set of these challenges, it is already indicated that urban war is not what it used to be. Plenty of points have been made about whether urban warfare has changed during the time of history or not. And it's fair to say that some of the basic features are still the same. The clearing of a house, a street, a block, the need for ground troops and firepower. And on the other hand, a lot has changed. In 1909, two Chinese colonels, Liang and Zhang wrote an article called Unrestricted Warfare. They wrote, "The first rule of unrestricted warfare is that there are no rules, with nothing forbidden." They explain unrestricted warfare as being warfare which transcends all boundaries and limits. Thus, all the boundaries between the world of war and the world of non-war, and between military and non-military, will be destroyed. It's fair to say that the character of war has changed, or at least is changing. This goes, of course, also for war in cities. We might label it transformation of wars as Frank Krefeld, or new wars as Mary Kaldor and also Herfried Münkler, or hybrid wars with Frank Hoffman. The terms are not synonymous, but they share some of the same characteristics. War, armed conflicts, most common earlier between states, are a lot more rare at present times and will probably also be in the future. New non-state actors have entered the scene in the shape of an asymmetric or hybrid adversary, and it's widely agreed that this is the adversary we will primarily going to face in the years ahead. As we have seen in the recent years in Iraq, Gaza, and Syria, these actors withdraw into the cities. A strategy of avoiding fighting in cities is then not an option. They hide among civilians and behind them, abuse critical infrastructure to make it very difficult for conventional forces to avoid civilian casualties and to comply to the principle of international humanitarian law. The development and use... Okay. The development and use of air power, weapons technology, and with that precision-guided weapons have contributed to the fact that civilian casualties have become a major focus in the Western public's perception of armed conflict. Casualties are no longer regarded as a necessary consequence of the employment of certain means in armed conflict in order to achieve certain ends. This is of course used by the asymmetric enemy, who often sees an advantage in displaying as many victims and human suffering as possible. And this can be done in a second. The media presence in the battlefield, which became a reality in the siege of Beirut in '82, changed the scope of attention the warring parties had to pay, as did the emergence of media presence in the battlefield with internet access, which became very clear to the Israelis in the conflict with Hezbollah in 2006. And in addition, everybody in the battlefield with a mobile phone with camera and internet access, and not least access to social media, have taken information warfare to very new complex levels. Tactical incidents can be taken directly and instantly from the physical battlefield to the strategic political level by influencing or manipulating public opinion, whether it's domestic public opinion, local population, global population, or the public opinion of troop contributing countries. The transfer of war to civilian domains or globalization of war reach back in history, but it also points to the future. Several groups like the Chechen fighters in Grozny, Hamas, and Hezbollah have understood very well to use public opinion to change tactical defeat into strategic victories. They are very much aware that public opinion can provide even more constraints on political decision makers than I shall. So, in order to try then to contribute to the existing body of urban warfare, it makes very good sense to gain further insight from actors with actual experience in urban warfare, who have also dealt with asymmetric or hybrid operations. And in this context, especially the US and Iraq and Israel and Lebanon, Gaza Strip and West Bank stand out. The advantages of analyzing the Israeli-Arab war conflicts are that they're extensive, they're varied, spans more than 30 years, they're well documented and relatively accessible, and mostly against the same adversaries. Therefore, this cycle of operations offer a unique insight into a fairly well-defined learning space where it's possible to study how the different parties have related to changes in the opponent's way of fighting in an urban environment. The Israeli-Arab conflicts also offer insights into two key features associated with urban combat: the question of compliance with international humanitarian law and all the adversaries' abuse of them, and the presence of media in the battlefield. Therefore, my project looked like that. Consists of 3 parts. Because of the absolute importance of the urban warfare aspects I've just discussed, the first part of the project will consist of 8 chapters, as you can see there. These chapters will be the foundation that enable a thorough and focused analysis of the Israeli-Arab wars in an urban warfare perspective. The second part of the project will begin with an analysis of the different actors, thus enabling the contextual frame. On this background, the historical analysis of the wars and conflicts will be conducted chronologically. The method of structured, focused comparison developed by Alexander George will be used. This rather simple method will make the different wars or conflicts speak the same language. The focus will thus be the same for all of the conflicts or wars. So, to conclude, my project will hopefully, by taking an interdisciplinary approach and focusing on the strategic political level and analyzing historically the Israeli efforts against an asymmetric or hybrid enemy, contribute to the existing but rather diffuse mass of urban warfare theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a most illuminating lecture, Claudia. And now I shall invite to the podium Dr. Nimrod Hagiladi, who has gained his PhD from the Hebrew University quite some years ago, and he's now lecturing at the Staff College, and I think in another one of the universities, I presume, no, a little bit as an external. Please proceed, and we shall be delighted to hear you. And again, you have 20 minutes. Try to stick to it. Okay.
Everything is fine.
Yes. Aerial welfare, and he will give in the Israeli War of Independence. Please.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here and give the lecture. So, that lecture will focus on the 48 War, Independence War of Israel, and the Air Force, and the shaping of the operational concept of the young, very young Air Force. So, before the Israeli Air Force in 48, first of all, was establishing almost from scratch. And the main focus, or the main question that a lot of people ask already, is how to do it. And what I'm going to focus in this lecture is the design of operational concepts of the Air Force and its mission, because a lot of studies already done about equipment, about operational stuff and so on, but not so much about the design of the concept and the big blocks on it. So before 48, Israel had the Haganah organization, and within it there were some pioneers that already thought that Israel should have in the future an Air Force. And we can put the finger in the 40s about two main two main, I think, elements that shaped later the Israeli Air Force. One is the Palmach Squadron, meaning volunteer force, very small, but with a lot of ambitions and military spirit that later on shaped the ideas at the 50s and mainly the 60s. And together with this, the RAF that control Palestine, and you can see the spread of the Air Force bases, British Air Force bases during the 40s, during the Second World War, and a lot of Israeli volunteers to the RAF and other air forces. For example, Modi Alon in the right, the first commander of the first fighter squadron, 101. So those two forces, local one and ideas from outside, shaped the Israeli Air Force in 48 and later on. But all those were only the beginnings, and as David Ben-Gurion said already at the beginning of the fights at January 48, that the change from protecting a point to defending the country requires new tools, and we will need more heavy machines, guns and fighter planes, and bombers. And no less, we need a new education of our manpower. And by that, basically, he gave the Russia to move forward and shape the Air Force. So just to give a big picture of the Air Force, and again, I'm going to focus on the concept, but the Air Force, as I mentioned, was off the shelf. They took, because for example, to construct pilots today, it's something that takes 5 years. 3 years in the course and then 2 years in the squadron, and only after 5 years, young people are able to fly to combats. So how to do it from January or April to June. So you took from off the shelf. You buy planes, but you also buy fighters, and you buy pilots, and you buy ammunition and so on, and you don't establish it, but buy it. So aircrews were Jews and non-Jews from around the world, mainly from the Anglo-Saxon world, but not only. And the aircraft, again, whatever comes first. In December, only 2 planes that we cannot see RW-30. And after a year, more or less, more than 100 planes, but different kinds of. So you had one Catalina, one other plane, and so on. And mainly shaped because of, and we'll discuss it, the embargo that forced the Israeli Air Force to buy whatever they could, and not only by plan. So, again, I want to focus on the operational concepts and how they were shaped, and discuss on 2 main fields. One is the offensive operations and the defense theory. And before that, what happened in the world, mainly in the 30s and during the Second World War, that Israel already knew. The people fly at the other places and knew. So tactical Air Force and strategic Air Force, main concept of how to use that new tool that we have. Because the Air Force is something quite new, 1903, the Wright brothers, First World War, the first, or just before that, but 1911, the first use of air power in war. And during the 20s and 30s, different air forces designed their concept how to do the things. So tactical Air Force, the missions of the Air Force was basically work with the ground forces in what we call today a combined air-land battle. The power, basically the aircraft and personnel are light planes, easy to the battleground, with a lot of doctrine that shaped and training. And the question that actually is above all is what is the purpose, what is the role of the Air Force? And basically, the role of the tactical Air Force is to achieve victory on the battleground. And maybe the Luftwaffe was the model for that kind of an Air Force, when they had to build their Air Force in the 30s, they choose basically that line. Just a remark, it's not 1 or 0 game. Each Air Force at the time, at the 30s and 40s, have some of both, some tactical level and some strategic. But where do you put the money? Where is the main effort? So the German Luftwaffe built itself as a tactical that worked together with the ground forces. And for example, they designed plans for it. And that plan, the Junkers 87 or the Stuka, use a dive bomber, very light, can take off from grass airfields, very accurate with its dive, and it can hit small targets as tanks and so on. And together with the tanks, basically that's what led to the Blitzkrieg, because the idea of the Blitzkrieg is penetrating with armor, crossing the defense of the enemy, and when the tanks running fast, they don't have artillery to support them, then the aircraft, or those Junkers, for example, Stuka, but not only them, will pave the way with artillery from the air. And that worked dramatically in Poland 39, in France 40, in Russia 41. So basically that was the idea of at least at the beginning of the war, Second World War. The Strategic Air Force took totally different idea, and basically the force main role was to defeat the enemy by targeting not the battleground, not the enemy, but its population, factories, city, industry, and we just heard about the city. So the city are the main purpose of those kind of air forces. And you can see the design of the force is something completely different. Those heavy bombers, for example, the B-17 in the right and the Lancaster to the left, are four engines plants, very heavy. They almost cannot maneuver, so they fly straight forward and bomb from high above, like 20,000 feet and so on, and even more. And of course, you cannot hit accurately, so you're going to cities. And the idea behind it, we can mention Billy Mitchell, one of the founders of the American Air Force, used to fight in Western Front in the First World War in France. So in his writing, we can find a lot of phrases like that. It is now realized that the hostile main army in the field is a false objective, and the real objective are the vital centers. Air power can attack the vital centers of the opposing country directly, completely destroying and paralyzing them. And those were not empty words, because the Strategic Air Force of for example, the British Bomber Command or the 8th Air Force of the American Air Forces was basically done what Mitchell said. It was hitting city after city in Germany or in Japan, Tokyo, and the idea, I don't know if you can read it, to hit the people, and by that to destroy the will to resist. So it goes to the moral effect. Basically, it should act on the leadership, because you still have the army on the battleground, but the leadership have to decide to withdraw from battle and so on. So those are two main air forces that established during the 30s and the 40s. And now we're going back to Israel Air Force 48. The people at the time had a vision. Yeah, they had only 2 airplanes, but they were very ambitious, and they now have the opportunity to create a new air force. So what should be the air force? Strategical one, tactical one, both, some from both. Basically, there were few plans during the war. First was, or not first, before that there were other, but that was the first impressive and important plan for the operating or the establishing of the new Air Force. To the left, Aaron Remez, the son of David Remez, then high official in Mapai and the yeah, transportation, exactly. The Minister of Transportation at the first government. And to his right, Hermann Schachtman, both were pilots. Schachtman at the American Air Force, Remez at the RAF, both fighters. So what happened in the world, experience the combats in one degree or another. They had ties to the leadership. For example, I can talk with my daddy and give him the ideas, and it's help. And he will pass it to David Ben-Gurion. So in October 47, they plan how to establish the new Air Force with a lot of ideas of what to purchase and how to spread it and so on. I won't detail that fact, but what consider the doctrine or the concept, basically they focus on a tactical per se. Tactical Air Force, no more than this, that its aim to support the ground forces, to protect from air raids of the enemy, and that's it. They were an important people, not because of Remez's father, but because Remez became the chief of staff of the Air Force, and since June or July, he was the Air Force commander. In order to deter the Arab armies, we must remember that since May 15, almost each day the Egyptian Air Force bombed Tel Aviv a couple of times a day, dozens of casualties each bomb. Iraqi Air Force joined them in a while. So Israel wanted to do something that will shake that situation, and David Ben-Gurion himself directly ordered Remez to do those raids. Not so many, and again, Zev will discuss it, I guess, in the future, but it was something unaccording to the plan, but that's irregular that basically picture the regular. Now I want to move two more minutes, okay, to the aerial defense system. I don't have much time to discuss it, but basically the model is again a British model that already shaped in the Second World War or even before. So you have a system, a whole system of detect. You can see the radar, you can see the scouts to the left that give the information. You can see the diagram, give the information to the control command in the center, and then fighters are in high alarm, waiting for a signal, and then they jump to the air, and that's what worked in the Battle of Britain. That's what worked also for Germany during the night raids of the British and so on. So that system was known by the people, and we look what happened at 48. So basically that's idea of 48. That's the diagram of Israel Air Force with lack of radars and so on. But basically they built the same, exactly the same. You can see the same diagram, the same attitude. They just took it from what they knew in Britain and copied it with the scouts, with the anti-aircraft guns, with fighters at high alert, and especially what is so important, the central control and command. And already in June, they succeeded in defeating the Egyptian bombs. You can see the first air fight, dogfight, interception, exactly, between Modi Alon, the commander of the Air Force, of the 101 Squadron with his Messerschmitt to the right, against Dakota, and that's a real picture that took June 3rd, 1948, seconds before he shot it. And what is interesting, and I think that's the point, the interesting and important point, that Israel took the idea of central command and control and enlarged it and expanded it not only to defense as their origin in Britain or Germany, but to all the missions of the Air Force. So for example, if you're going to attack in an offensive operation, then everything is controlled from the headquarters. Unlike the British model, well, the control and command is only, or the control is only, central control is only for defense, because a lot of reasons, we won't discuss it, but in attack missions, then you have the freedom to do whatever you need to do in order to achieve the goal, to achieve the mission. In the Israel Air Force, it's not so much, and it's something that shaped during the year, and today is totally control almost every move of the pilots. So, that's it. Israel Air Force done a lot of things during the war, I won't discuss them, but when we look at, so first of all, the volunteers, people from Israel like Remez and Shechtman and outside like Kovac, shaped with a lot of ideas from aboard, from the world, and shaped and create a new Israeli Air Force. And they created Tactical Air Force. Tactical Air Force that started at 48 and operated at 48, but its climax, that kind of Air Force, or a tactical that support the ground and force, reached its climax at 67, and in a lot of ways, we might say that Israel creating a modern or a Luftwaffe that will support the Israeli Blitzkrieg, that again in 67 reached 100% its goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Giladi, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. So please, maybe we'll get some questions and then you will address them. Please, Benny first. Always Benny is first.
Only one suggestion to Claudia for your research. I think the case of Beirut in 1982, it will be a very illuminating one for you, because we had a lot of factors that you just noted that are involved there, and especially because the enemy was combined from terrorists and also regular army, I mean the PLO and Syrians. And the siege of 45 days ended with the surrender of the besieged, and you know PLO went into exile to Tunisia, and the Syrian units went to Damascus back. And what you can find there is very good sources, also from the Christian point of view, like Walid Halidi that read, and also from PLO, Karim Bakradouni, Walid Halidi. You have many sources that you can use, and also from the IDF point of view. And this was the only example in Arab-Israeli wars that we besieged a capital of, I mean, it's not a mega city, but it's a modern city, and all what happens there. Right. Second thing is a question to Dr. Giladi, Hagil-Adi. What Kovac says about the, let's say, using air transportation behind enemy lines, like, you know, Operation Dust, Avak. That was one of the main achievements in this attitude to assist the ground forces.
Thank you very much. Please, did you want to ask? Please go ahead, and then after Dr. Meisel, yes.
Okay, I'm James Coram, American, and I have a question for Shlomi Shetit. When the Palestine Mandate was set up, there was a very large British police force that needed new employment. I'm talking about the Black and Tans in Ireland. And I know that some of them ended up in leading the Malaya police and giving sort of their character to that. And I suspect that a fair number of them came to Palestine and gave sort of the Black and Tan approach to policing to Palestine. And I just wanted to know how, if you had looked at the records of all the early Mandate British policemen, and what was the connection with maybe the Black and Tan experience in Ireland?
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Meisel, please.
Thank you. I'm Mathieu Meisel from Tel Aviv University. I have a question both to Ms. Claudia Larsen-Pedersen and to Shlomi Shetit. First, on our really illuminating lecture on urban warfare and its modern. One thing that you said is that in such a warfare there are no rules. And I wonder, rules are not required to be specific and explicit and written down. Rules could be also common law, I mean, the way we have. And which refers to two things. How about unconventional weapons? Now, if there are no rules, there are no non-conventional weapons. So everything is accepted, including chemical warfare, nuclear warfare. Now, we did see cases of chemical warfare. How about certain country which declared or did not declare having nuclear weapon, using it in certain cases? And we can go on, because I say, okay, we have this kind of model, or how about other models of development? That's one. And then I would like to ask Shlomi Shetrit, actually 3 questions. One is, what happened to the Palestinian Arabs serving in the British Mandate Police? Second is that the Israeli police started not as an independent police force within the state system, but it was a component of the IDF, of the army. And that's, in a way, it's contradiction in terms. So what happened to the police force at that time? And third, it refers also to Jim Coram's question, the memoir literature. What I have in mind is Bernard Ferguson, who was the deputy chief of the Mandate Police, and he wrote his memoirs, which are fun to read on many occasions. But again, he has this Ireland experience. He fought in the Second World War. He has a chapter on Tobruk affair, and he was involved in certain, really still until today, very sensitive question in Palestine in '46. You know. Okay, so please, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I think we'll leave it at that as far as the questions are concerned, and I shall ask each one of you to answer very briefly. You don't have to answer all the questions, especially if you don't know the answers. You don't have the questions, and you can leave something for outside. So shall we start at the same order? Shlomi Shetrit, please, would you like, but very, very briefly, please.
First, regarding the Arab policemen. Some of them actually were recruited to the Israel police after a few months. Some of them were recruited from prisoner camps, which is funny. You come into a prisoner camp as a guard and you start recruiting people for your police force. There were 2 Arab-Palestinian police units established by the British in Jaffa and in Jerusalem during December to February 1948. There isn't much materials regarding them, and by May 15, neither existed. So either they left the police or they became refugees. Some of them continued serving under Jordanian or Egyptian rule in Gaza, in Judea, Samaria. Some of them, by the way, after 1967, re-recruited to the Israel police in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. Regarding not being independent, the Israel police, I didn't get to it. It was established as under the command of the general staff of the IDF. However, Ben-Gurion, and you've seen it in the order to the Haganah command, defined it very clearly that the police will be completely autonomous in its operation. And during the very few months that they operated under the IDF, which was about until I think October or November of '48, I haven't found any reason to think that the IDF affected the Israeli police professionally. Regarding the Royal Irish Constabulary, Black and Tans, the memoirs of Ferguson, these had a lot of effect on the Palestine police force, mainly during its early years. In 1948, you don't have many of these in the police. Those who are district commanders or high-ranking officers, because they have been in service for about 30 years. There's a lot of work done regarding it. My colleague is writing his dissertation on that, so if you want, I can connect between you two. And it's a very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Claudia Pedersen.
First, thanks to you, Benny Michelson, for giving me some hints on the First Lebanese War. And to the questions, I was putting the two Chinese generals on the unrestricted warfare, and there was no rules, and that might be a trend that we see in the future. It is also quite clear, at least to I think the Israelis and also maybe the Americans, that the IHL as we see today can be very hard to comply with, and a lot of the categories and a lot of the concepts in the IHL are getting very blurred when we are going to fight this adversary we see today. What is a competent, what is a non-competent, how do we distinguish what is proportional, and so on. A lot of these concepts that derive from another area are blurred. But about the unconventional weapons as chemical weapons, I think that it's interesting to notice that the police force in the US and also I guess in other countries, not in Denmark, I think are allowed to use, for instance, CS gas that goes as a chemical weapon and is forbidden by the IHL. And when the police uses it, it has some advantages. That's why they're doing it, and it doesn't kill people at least. So maybe we have to think in new terms of what may be allowed in order to actually save lives. I also heard a suggestion, I'm not saying it's my opinion, but I have heard it here in Israel actually, that we see now, Mosul was completely destroyed. We see a lot of destruction in Syria as well of the cities. Somebody suggested, what if we used chemical gas instead? Maybe people will die, yes, but the city will probably survive. A lot of the buildings, the structure, it will be inhabitable again at some point. So, I'm not suggesting that we kill everybody with chemical gas or whatever, but I think that we have to think in new terms and maybe be a more creative in the way we go ahead and conduct especially urban warfare in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Nimrod.
So, Benny asked about the tactical transport, and one of the chapter in Kovacs article is the tactical use of transport aircraft. And it's a very detailed chapter, five pages of how to use it. And first of all, Operation Dust is one by one according to the plan, but more than this, I think he was, like all of his plan, very visionary and ambitious. And if you're looking today for transportation of light brigade or something like that, I think Kovacs is one of the chapter, and he had a chapter about paratroopers and how to use them in order to capture Rafah and El Arish and so on. So in a lot of ways, he was very imaginary and very creative.
All right, thank you. I would like to thank the participants, the lecturers, the scholars, who gave us quite food for thought, I think. And I think we should discuss other things in the break now. Okay, thank you very much.